Welcome to It's Bloody Complicated, the Compass podcast. I'm Neil Lawson, your host and director of Compass. Joining me to help manage the questions is Grace Barnett from the Compass office. Hello, Grace.
Hello.
These are unprecedented times, and we need to rise to the new and enormous challenges we now face. Over the next few weeks, we'll be speaking with writers, thinkers, politicians, journalists, and public service workers about how we come out of this mess in much better shape than we went in, a good society after COVID-19. These conversations have live access for Compass members who can put their own questions directly to our guests. If you'd like to participate in a live call and help support all of our work, go to compassonline.org.uk/podcast to join Compass today. Otherwise, sit back, relax, and enjoy this week's podcast. This week on the Compass podcast, we're delighted to have Danny Dorling, the geography professor who writes about geography and just about everything else, but especially inequality. Even if there was nothing topical to talk about, which I guess there just might be this week, Danny published 3 books last year. 3. We'll come to each of them in turn in a bit. As ever, the format will be, I'll ask Danny some questions, and it's over to you, the Compass members, to ask your questions. So, Danny Dorling, as ever, we'll start with the question, where are you and how are you feeling?
I'm in Oxford and I'm feeling surprisingly chirpy. I haven't enjoyed lockdown at all, but for some reason, today is a good day.
And what have you disliked most about lockdown?
I've realised I'm a narcissist and I live on travelling around the country, getting on trains, doing talks to people. I used to moan about having to do it and I didn't realise how much I actually enjoyed doing that. And I don't like being stuck in one place. Realising you're a narcissist is quite brutal, particularly when you're trapped at the same time.
Well, we're glad to have some people to talk with and tonight, Danny. So, let's just get to the big news of the last week, obviously. We're going to get a new president in the USA. What are you thinking about that? What's been your reaction so far? Because we've all had quite visceral kind of, emotive responses.
Well, it was a relief. That's my main reaction was relief. I have at work my granddad's diary from the 1930s. And he has a little entry at one point, I think in 1933, where it just says, Hitler elected, and then it says gone for a walk. Now, Trump was pretty bad news. It's still pretty bad news, and it needn't have gone this way, and it has gone this way. And simply relief more than celebration.
Let's move that on then. What hopes do you have for the new administration?
It's always difficult in progressive politics because the United States produces, in general, the least progressive politicians. Its Democratic Party, in general, are to the right of even the most sort of right-wing social democratic parties in Europe. So you should never have too high a hope. And then you can always be sort of surprised. Even a Barack Obama, who's maybe the biggest hero since Kennedy, the number of drone strikes that he sanctioned and so on, it's not a great record. So don't set your hopes too high. But what we must not forget is just how awful Trump was. And to simply go immediately into moaning, why can't Biden be more interesting and so on. And of course, one possibility is that he steps aside early at one point and we get a more interesting potential president from the vice president. I don't want to be nasty to Biden, but I don't think that would necessarily be a bad thing if we were to see that transition, which could happen even within the 4 years, rather than her standing necessarily afterwards.
I suppose just to come back on that, we're not impossibilists. We are pragmatic people here at Compass. But I guess my worry is that another kind of, whether it's a failure or just, another progressive leadership that doesn't deliver, that just kind of sows the seeds of a Trump or a Trump-like figure to come back again. That's the real worry for me.
Yeah, that's a scare. In a way, the pandemic may be an advantage. The Great Depression gave Roosevelt the reason for doing the New Deal and so on in radical American politics in the past. The pandemic makes different things necessary, and it may well be. Wars traditionally have been a way that we've seen equality rise dramatically, things actually get better in the aftermath of a war. This is the nearest thing to a war that we've had since 1945, certainly in terms of government spending and the situation that we're in. That may well force the Democrats and a Senate in which they do not control to do things which are actually progressive. It may not be possible to do it otherwise, because otherwise so many people will go so hungry in the United States. Unemployment will rise so high because we're in the middle of a global recession. We were going into a global recession even before the pandemic began, and we're only keeping demand artificially high now through various schemes, which are keeping people in jobs which won't exist in a year's time from now.
But I guess, and while we welcome the kind of the renewal of the reliance on the state, I guess, what's being shown, by Trump and certainly here by the Conservatives, is that right-wing governments can use the power of the state and the investment of the state and still be right-wing. So they can do that as much as a left-wing government could invest. Does that mean the end of kind of Trumpism, populism, hard right conservatism?
Oh, no, I know, and we made a mistake in thinking it ever went away. There will always be an attraction to some people for authoritarian father figures who you can just leave it to them and they say what you would like to say in public, but you can't. That is always there. You can see it in the most equal societies in Scandinavia and the Nordic countries. A small group of the population will vote for people like that. The problem comes when a large amount of the middle class, and this is what happened in America, it was the middle class who voted for Trump, particularly white men. And in Britain, it's the middle class who voted Brexit. I have this endless argument with people about this in the south of England, and who like Boris Johnson. And it's when your middle class in large numbers goes for a right-wing populist that things become very, very dangerous. But to be optimistic about this, across Europe in the last few years, we have seen the far right fall. The most spectacularly in Greece, with Golden Dawn being imprisoned. But the second most spectacular thing was, and it's sad to put it this way, but this is one of the ways, the country which had by far the largest number of MEPs who were to the right of the European People's Party, the Conservative Party of Europe, has left the EU, and that is us. So the biggest drop in far-right MEPs in Europe has occurred thanks to us leaving the EU. I'm very, very sad that we've left the EU, but people always report the far-right rising. They never report it falling, and we don't report our victories. Okay,
good. And you've mentioned the B word already, and I know that you're an avid campaigner against Brexit and writer. Do you think that the change of administration in America is going to kind of have much of an effect on the nature and type of Brexit that we're now going to go through?
I'd be surprised if it didn't have an effect. I think it's reduced the confidence of some of the gung-ho men who believe in Empire 2.0. I think it's quite nice that John Major's speech, they made a big issue about the fact he'd pre-recorded it. The speech saying we are at the top of rank 2 of the world and this is one of the greatest crimes. There will still be these men who believe in Empire 2.0 and Britain can become the richest place on the planet in 15 years due to Brexit. But without Trump, they're increasingly isolated. Well, one thing we've got to get ready for is that the spotlight of the world will now move from America and laughing at Donald. And I'm afraid it is going to start to move towards us and laughing at us, because Donald provided a kind of shield for Boris. Boris didn't look as ridiculous as Donald. Without Donald there, Boris is going to look like a complete fool.
I'm laughing at people laughing at us. I shouldn't be laughing at people laughing at us.
It might be good for us because, we did... how do you cure a form that... the centre of the largest empire the world has ever known? Maybe being the butt of some jokes worldwide might be the thing that actually... we're supposed to be good about our sense of humour. Yeah. We're supposed to be able to take it.
I suppose in all of that, what I worry about with both Johnson, and Trump is that we laugh at them a lot, and okay, not in every country, but in Britain, and I think in America, 70 million people voted for this person after 4 years of disaster, after indecency, after everything. 70 million still voted for him, and we keep laughing. And at some levels, they are funny. At other levels, they're really serious and really dangerous, and we need to get really serious about the threat that they pose. Yeah. And although we poke fun at them, probably we should poke less fun and poke more seriousness at them.
Yeah, no, we should say that, Trump was a racist who was happy to see black people die and would send in military forces which would do that. And as it's been said by Labour MPs, Johnson is a racist. He's written things which are racist in the past. He's used racist language. I can laugh at him, but also say, among his many, many faults, he is a racist.
Yeah. Okay, let's leave the racists to one side. Let's turn to you and your work. Tell us a bit, Danny, about your professional life so people can kind of locate you.
I went to Newcastle in 1986 to do a degree in geography and maths. And I worked out the geography bit was a bit easier than the maths, and I've been stuck in that ever since. People can go to university and get stuck, and that's what happened to me. Geography's lovely, though, as a subject. because there aren't that many rules about what you have to do. In fact, you're allowed to look at almost anything you want. You can study volcanoes or rivers or people or animals even. And the reason there aren't any rules is that geography in Britain was established just over 100 years ago to train young men how to be colonial officers. That was the reason for the first geography department. And you had to know about rivers and people and cities if you're going to run Nigeria. Now, when the colonies went, the subject no longer had a core reason to exist. We didn't need to train young people to be colonial officers because there wasn't a demand for them anymore. That's created a very amorphous subject now, and then very luckily for us, sorry to go on about it, we used to have people who loved going up the Alps and measuring glaciers because they were convinced that the Ice Age was coming, and they were geographers. And every year they go up to measure how much the glacier had come down, and they found that things were melting and going back up. So now geography is the subject of climate change and inequality and all these very trendy things, partly by accident. I shouldn't have really mentioned the colonial bit because it's a bit embarrassing.
We'll throw those statues in the doc. So, and you've kind of inferred it, really, but you know, some of the most interesting people, most interesting political people, like you, like David Harvey, like Dorling Massey, were geographers. Why are really interesting left-wing political people geographers?
Because of the freedom you have. If you work in politics, if you're an academic in politics, to get credibility you have to appear independent and not to align to any particular cause so you can rise above it. Because of this lack of rules in geography, because of this kind of anything really goes subject, nobody tells you can't do something. That is very, very useful. And it allows people who don't fit in somewhere where you can fit in, because most people in the geography department in a British university don't actually fit in that well. Because they study their separate things. I used to work in Sheffield, and my colleague opposite me was an expert in soils. Knew all about soils. It may sound very boring, but it's different. And so you're not kind of all pushed in the same direction as you are in another academic subject towards looking at one way at one thing.
And were you left-wing before you went to Newcastle to do geography and maths, or did being a geographer make you more left-wing?
No, I grew up in a left-wing family, so it was inculcated in me early. And in fact, geography isn't actually a left-wing subject. Or traditionally, it's a subject which young people from more affluent backgrounds are more likely to study. So traditionally, there's quite a lot of fairly right-wing students that you approach. Not their fault they're right-wing, it's just the way they were brought up, the same as I was brought up. But one interesting thing about it is that you have these students turning up disproportionately from affluent backgrounds with right-wing parents, and you can chuck them out with a somewhat different set of skills, put it that way. So it's a nice subject to be in.
I reckon by the time they're 18 and going to university, it is their fault if they're right wing, to be honest. But that's another subject for another day. Give us a quick run through some of your recent work, your prodigious kind of output, both in terms of quality, quantity, and range. You've had 3 books this year. I don't know if this is quite the publishing order, but just talk us through each of them a bit. Rule Britannia, why did you do that, and what's that about?
Rule Britannia, this is a second edition, so I didn't really do 3 in 1 year. Rule Britannia was a book I wrote with Sally Tomlinson to do with Brexit. The second edition, which came out this year, has a whole special chapter on Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson at the end and what's happened up to the spring of this year. That book, Rule Britannia, is all about what is odd about the UK. Why was it the UK rather than any other 27 countries that left? What was different about us? So it's a geography book. The second one was Slow Down. It's a book that took 6 years to write, so they all came out at the same time. And Slow Down is a book about long-term trends in the world. And basically, it's as it says on the tin, things are slowing down. The rate of economic growth is slowing down. The rate of population growth is slowing down. I claim the rate of innovation is slowing down. I tend to do things so I can measure things. And the last book of the 3 is a book called Fintopia. And it's a lovely little book about Finland. Finland is the country that scored number 1 on the World Happiness Index each year for the last 3 years. It ranks 1st, 2nd or 3rd on over 100 social indicators of being good as a country. It records the lowest infant mortality rate ever recorded in human history a few years ago. And the Finns, unfortunately, are quite quiet and modest. So when you have a country that gets things right, you need somebody who's a bit less modest to sort of say, look, things are going, hardly any homelessness in Finland, best educational system in the world. You can go on and on. Green targets are incredible. And it's Finland has a progressive alliance, let's put it that way. The 5 political parties are in charge, working together Absolutely incredible. And the best thing about Finland, from my point of view, is that when a politician commits the most tiny of indiscretions, they resign. They just go because how could they possibly carry on? And it's not utopia, but from where we're sitting in Britain, it is quite stunning just to see what Finland is like.
And what do you think is repeatable here from the Finnish experience?
The hard news is slog. I mean, it took Finland a long time from the 60s, 70s, and 80s to achieve what it's got. But the kind of one good news, which may not sound like good news, Finland has managed this with a lower GDP per head than other Nordic countries. Finland shows that it's possible without increased wealth to create a much better society. And it did so out of adversity. It's also very competitive. I mean, it is competitive on the world stage over its innovation and what it produces. It's competitive over its ambitions to hit carbon zero, net zero, much earlier than other countries want to do. Not just because it's the right thing to do, but that gives you a great advantage economically in the world. So there's a load of things that could be learned from Finland. And we tend not to look in that direction. We tend to look at Norway, which has the oil wealth, but Finland shows you how to do it when you have less money.
And the slowdown book. I mean, the only book I've written one book in my life, and it was the hardest thing that I've ever done. And that's why I'm in awe of you. My book was on consumer society. And I just feel that that's always been, I felt up until now that consumption and the need to slow down and not consume so much was critical to a good society. I still think that's critical. But going back to the conversation about the populists and the populist right, I think, for 30 years, they ruled us through a politics of desire. But now I think they want to rule us through a politics of fear. Do you agree with that?
They can't carry on using desire because, we just can't buy more than we were buying anyway, and our rubbish bins are full. So fear is another one to use, where they talk about solidarity within the country. Everybody inside the country is going to be looked after, but stopping anybody from outside getting there. They will try anything. They will try anything, but the spotlight not to go onto their lives, their friends, their corruption, what they're doing with the money, how they look down on other people. They have a basic attitude that they are superior, mentally superior. The rest of us are either deluded, which is what they think of me, or slow, which is what they often think about me, let alone people who are not Oxford professors. And they're just stuck in that way of thinking, but they're devious. And they will work very, very hard to try to keep hold of power. As the world slows down, as GDP per head doesn't increase like it increased for our parents and grandparents, as there aren't kind of new amazing freebies, like cars, planes, all those kind of things that happened, selling the idea of don't worry about inequality now, the future will be so much better for your children doesn't work, because the future for people's children is paying a landlord's rent that they can only barely manage to do. It isn't an exciting, interesting future. So yes, they can try fear, but you've got to remember they've almost sort of run out of fear on, say, immigration, which is the big one for all of my lifetime. Constant anti-immigrant rhetoric from the right wing. Now, because of COVID, we've hit a point, statistics came out, I think, today, of massive drops in immigration. Who would come and do a skivvying job in London or the southeast of England for almost no money, when there's a chance that you may not be able to get back home easily, and also you won't have any rights, and so on. So making people scared of immigrants when there are no immigrants coming anymore is going to be quite difficult to do. But they'll try and find another fear.
Another scapegoat. And then, I'm sorry, I'm dodging about, but back to slowdown. So you're not an advocate of fully automated luxury communism. You don't think, aren't we living through the biggest technological revolution ever that's creating marginal cost goods that we can all access for free and all shunt around, very, very quickly? Is this not, our lives do feel faster in many, many ways, don't they?
We're told they feel faster. I mean, look, they haven't felt faster in the last 8 months. At least we could agree that. There's a book called Lamborghinis for All.
Yeah, I know.
Capitalism will mean you can all have a Lamborghini.
Yeah,
obviously, you just have a traffic jam of Lamborghinis. The 1930s were this era of the biggest change. My dad took me to the Oxford car. I grew up in Oxford, and he took me to the car plant in Oxford as a teenager to stop me being lazy at school. So he actually showed me the men working on the line. There were, I think, at least 40,000 men involved, and maybe as many as 25,000 working on the production lines. And they were awful. They were noisy, horrible. They aged you 10 years. BMW in Oxford now, 1,200 silent robots are making the electric Mini. It's beautiful. This is old technology. It's not new. It's great. But it's, robots we've had for a long time. They're fine. And we don't need as many people working, but we're halfway through this revolution already. Our problem is that we have a model that says you must work. We will starve you if you can't find a job. We will not countenance paying benefits that you could possibly live on anymore when there simply isn't enough work to do, and production line work can be better done by machines. But we're already there. The robots have been in for years and years in the car factory in Oxford.
So you've teed me up to ask the question about basic income. Is that one of the answers to that problem?
Yes, basic income one of the answers. I just see it as the equivalent of unemployment in 1888. I think the word unemployment was first used around 1888. There wasn't any such thing before then. You just starved. And when people first introduced unemployment benefits, it was said, "Oh, this will be ridiculous. You can't do this. It's utterly wrong." You hear the same arguments about basic income now. It'll be introduced in all kinds of different ways at different levels and then ramped up. The most interesting thing about basic income is it gives you a sense of security. That means you can take risks. So it actually makes people more innovative. But it also means you can take a risk and say, I want to have a low consumption lifestyle. I'll work occasionally, but not always. But you won't starve. Whereas at the moment, if you say, I want to have a low consumption lifestyle, you're taking a hell of a risk with what might actually happen to you. So there are all kinds of environmental reasons, but it's about power. The reason that some people don't want basic income is they want people to be afraid. So they have to do what they want them to do, which is often work that they wouldn't otherwise do. It's the same reason we allow so many people to be homeless in Britain, because it's a visible warning. This is what will happen to you if you do not behave in a certain way. And America, of course, does it even more. Thousands and thousands of homeless people in the streets. The poor are there to police us. Yeah, I agree. You recently wrote a blog on science and the virus. I mean, when I read it, I thought it was a textbook case of why things are bloody complicated and why we need pluralism and why real dialogue matters. Tell us just a bit about that blog and why you wrote it. Why did I write it? Because I've been looking at the virus, as many people have since the beginning. I am mainly an armchair epidemiologist, although I have published papers in epidemiology journals. What was fascinating about this epidemic for me, and I know quite a lot of epidemiologists, was how quickly they fell into different camps and began to really dislike each other. And it was partly because this was a real unknown, and your expertise just can't help you with a new disease at the very beginning. And there's some very basic lessons from epidemiology which has partly been forgotten. One is, from the 1970s, you don't do anything until you've worked out how big the downside of doing it is compared to the upside of doing it. It's a basic rule by a former director of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And if you want an example of where it applies to schools, the shutting down of schools, one of the few things that many people have agreed on is that should never have happened in the first place. Now, you may well say, how could you have known that you shouldn't have shut down schools? And the argument is, without the evidence that you should do it, the default is you do not do that. So it's really about the argument going on that has been going on. The argument goes quieter when the deaths rise. At the moment, today's a Tuesday. Every Tuesday, ONS release the most reliable death figures, and they've gone up again, shockingly, I think, to 12% of all deaths 2 weeks ago were from COVID. So this second wave is big. And then you kind of get to kind of quietness with the fear. But over exactly what should happen, I'll give you one last example. University students. There's only been one paper that I've seen in the British Medical Journal about what is the effect of bringing university students back to university campuses. And that paper says that the number of cases of the disease will increase, the overall number of deaths will decrease. Now, it's the only paper. On the left, there is general majority that says it's terrible that students have gone back to universities. They shouldn't have gone back at all. But the implication would have been leaving them largely in leafy suburbs or southern English villages, but they don't all come from, but students tend to be more affluent than people who don't go to university, leaving these young people in areas with high proportions of old people, where it actually would be more dangerous to have them than on the campuses that those who have a campus have gone to. Now, that's all highly problematic. I'm sure I've annoyed several people listening that I've even mentioned it. But the point is, before you say students should not go back to campuses, you need an estimate of whether you'd be causing more harm or not by doing that, let alone to the students themselves. This is harm caused to other people. But I wrote that because I could, because my friends are involved in these big arguments. If you look at the University of Oxford, you'll see we have professors of medicine on both sides of the argument. It is very big here over to what extent should we lock down, to what extent should there be a bit of mixing, how much will waiting for a vaccine help? Will this magic 90% effective vaccine be the cure that everybody so desperately wants? And in a way, it's slightly like being in a war, where everybody wants the war to end, but nobody quite knows when it'll end or how it'll end or what the best way to end it will be.
Let's just end this bit before we hand over to Grace and the members. We hope for a different kind of government in this country eventually, and Compass is working towards that. What do you want to see from a kind of progressive government to put right the things that you see in your work, Danny?
Well, there's a lot. We have to accept that we're in a very bad place, at least on the European League table. So one of the main reasons we've had so many deaths and we're having to do what we have to do now with lockdown is we have one of the worst funded health services. That's a priority for me. I'd like to see the health service at least funded on a European average level. That's not asking for very much. Education, we have the most privatised education system in Europe. Again, it's talking like John Major. I never thought, I can remember being a young man when he was Prime Minister, and I dare you get old and start agreeing with John Major. But I would like us to have an education system that is slightly more like the European norm, where we're not charging young people $9,250 a year for a brand, where our children are not segregated more in schools than anywhere else on the continent. I can go on and on. But here's the way I'd be optimistic about this. Whenever you're in the worst position, as we currently are, almost inevitably you go up the ranks. It's impossible. It's like staying at the bottom of the league table for a football team, right? It's actually quite hard work to do it. So I do expect in the next 20 or 30 years to actually begin to see a move away from this. But a progressive government could actually help achieve that. And I could probably again argue with Compass members about one problem I think that we had was that we got to such a level of inequality by the late 1990s, by the time Major was Prime Minister, that we didn't realise how far we'd gone. And then when we finally got rid of the Conservatives and got what we thought was a progressive government in 1997, it did some good things, but it didn't actually turn the arrow. Inequality didn't fall. The rich didn't become less powerful. Segregation in education didn't reduce. In fact, they introduced university fees and they increased the spending on the health service a little bit, but not in a way that would mean that we now had a German health service, which they could have done. If you look back to 1997, that was the point at which you would have had to plan for the health service that we should have had for when the pandemic hit.
I'm not sure you'll be struggling with any Compass members on that point. That's the reason that Compass was here, because that isn't what happened then was good, but it wasn't good enough, and we want better.
Hello, this is Grace from the Compass office, interrupting for a moment. I'm lucky enough to come from a large and politically diverse family. We really did have the full political spectrum represented over Christmas dinner, but in spite of our differences, we still actually like each other. I've always known, because of this, that politics should be more about listening and learning from the people we disagree with than shouting at them and fighting with them. And of course, I've definitely known for a long time that it really is bloody complicated. The problem was that once I grew up, left home, I started to encounter for the first time the tribalism that sadly often dominates political conversations. So I was so happy that when one day I discovered Compass, quite by accident, through their brilliant work on the Progressive Alliance in the 2017 general election. Since then, it's been an absolute pleasure to once again be part of a political family where talking to people in different political parties, admitting that you alone don't have all the answers, is not just okay, but actively encouraged. So if you'd like to find out more about Compass, you can visit compassonline.org.uk. And now, back to the conversation.
Grace, over to you, and some more questions for some more people.
Sure. So the first question, this is the one with the most votes in the Q&A box, so we'll go with that to begin with. It's about the North-South divide.
Yes, Danny, I'm a great admirer of your work. Can the North-South divide ever be resolved?
It is a very old divide, so the first time we see it is in the Doomsday Book, which was 1086, after 20 years of harrowing of the North. So I'll make this question answer short. I won't go for the whole history of North-South divide. In the 1970s, there were several years in which the population centre moved northwards. So it's possible. Harold Wilson managed to do it. And there was a point in the early 70s after the Labour government of Wilson where life expectancy in Sheffield was better than the national average. So it's entirely possible. It's actually happened. And it could happen again. One major thing that might matter now is how people feel about working in skyscrapers in future. And if they carry on being a bit wary about working in skyscrapers and at high density, one advantage that part of London has may be reduced. And similarly, with packing onto very tight public transport, which again is a problem for London. So it could certainly be reduced, and it happened before.
Thanks. Nice answer to a very big question. Next question is coming from Claire.
Hi, yeah. It's Claire from South Staff, Green Party member and member of Extinction Rebellion, and very proactive in terms of climate change and inequalities. And my question is, do you think that cross-party working can push the climate agenda to be viewed as a priority issue that it should be in the context of policy making? Can the government be held to account before it's too late, i.e. the next election?
You mentioned Extinction Rebellion. I should say, as Neil was asking about my career in geography, my geography teacher is one of the reasons I went to do geography. And last time I saw her was in Trafalgar Square. She's a member of Extinction Rebellion. And it was raining and she had to get arrested because she had nowhere to stay that night. And she's older than me. And watching, quite incredible, watching, over 1,000 young people, was it spring just over a year ago, getting arrested in London for these protests. That won't go away. So politically, it is the highest thing on the agenda, apart from what is a relatively short-term crisis, which is the pandemic. And savvy politicians know this. They are aware. The problem is that it's really easy to do greenwash. It's easy for the Conservatives to pretend they care. It's easy for companies to produce on the front of their websites everything they're doing for the environment, when in fact they're making it worse. Just look at BP if you want a beautiful example about how to pretend you're environmentally good. But apart from the Conservative Party, I honestly think that in the rest of our politics of Britain, we largely have an understanding that matters. And what we should be working on is those members of the Conservative Party who also realise that this is a problem. But we're a long way away from this. I'll never forget going to Denmark, where I asked them about who was the most green party, and they told me all the political parties were green. And by this year, over half their electricity is coming from wind power. And I said, what do you do when the wind doesn't blow? And they replied to me and said, we'll smell. And I said, what do you mean you'll smell? And they said, because the washing machines will have to wait until the wind starts again. Such a different attitude to what we're doing. Or just look at what Germany's doing. This is a middle-of-the-road country in Europe. The Green New Deal in Germany right now as a way to get out of the depression of the pandemic. It's an enormous opportunity that's happening elsewhere. And it's the biggest advantage that progressive politics has, that it has this on its side, and it is irrefutable.
Thanks, Danny. Next question is coming from Ruth Lister.
Yeah, I just wondered whether you think that COVID has clearly exposed inequalities. I mean, the inequalities you have written about and we're all very aware of, but many people perhaps weren't so aware of. Do you think it will make it easier to persuade the Labour Party to adopt policies in the next time they're in power, that aim to reduce inequality significantly? And what do you think are the key arguments that we should be putting to them?
It's really interesting. If you'd sat us around in a room a year ago and asked us to predict the effects of the pandemic, we'd have got it utterly and completely wrong, I think. For years, for 4 or 5 years, I've been going on about how 50,000 more people died in 2015 because of austerity. 2018 was a bad year. 2017, I think it was the Red Cross it came in and said it was despicable that our hospitals are stopping all elective surgery, which they then did again for months. And nobody listened. 120,000 premature deaths before the pandemic. The minute you get a pandemic, and particularly one that affects business people and people who can go skiing at the beginning and hits famous celebrities and political leaders, you get a mixture of incredible fear, quite a lot of selfishness. It's because it could affect us, whereas austerity was never going to hurt me, that we've been frightened, but it has made people think about their mortality. in a way that most people have never thought about dying before. And all of this is potentially useful for the Labour Party to think over what it could do. Jeremy Corbyn's policies in the manifesto of December 2019 were only, I'm not saying this is ridiculous, but they were only to move public spending up to a fraction below German levels. He wasn't promising us Sweden or Finland or Norway. He was promised as Angela Merkel, without the immigration policies that the Germans have. Pretty pathetic, really. Now, this new era that we're in, where the middle class are worried about their children's future, where the young people who've lost most jobs have been those with degrees, right? You suddenly are all in together now. Now, in that situation, the Labour Party, which is a party largely run by the middle class, I would say for the middle class, who are with benevolent kind of ideas for other people, but if you look at who's in charge of it, suddenly the middle class are in trouble. And at that point, the Labour Party could do much more. The last time we were in a situation at all similar to this was 1945, when the middle class could no longer afford a doctor, when they were scared, and where their Labour Party, working class and middle class together, Attlee was a very posh man, produced a welfare state for the benefit of all. And we're in a similar situation with the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic. So I'm very optimistic about it. And this situation matters so much more than individuals, right? It matters more than Keir or Jeremy or John or so on. Right, the actual situation you find yourself in is what makes the big difference. And we have a cult of personality in individuals. Attlee couldn't string a speech together, had all kinds of personal sort of failings, but most successful Labour leader ever. But it was the right time for him. And so this could well be the right time, particularly for a magnanimous Labour Party that realises how small it is and realises that Scotland has largely gone, which means that the arrogant, we're going to do it all on our own thing really has to quietly disappear, let alone, given the last speaker, we have the smallest Green Party in Europe, and that is not a good thing. And the Labour Party really needs to work better with the Green Party. And the most stupid thing, I know you go on about this and the others, the thing that upsets me most in British politics is watching Green and Labour local councillors fighting each other for seats in cosmopolitan areas of places like the city I live in. What a complete waste of effort that is.
Yeah, thanks, Danny. Next question from Kate in Chester.
Thank you. I was very interested in your work and what you've proposed. These are very hard times. Every now and then there's a little flare of hope when people come up with new ideas about how they might build a local care home, for example, if they can dodge the regulations, that is funded locally and looked after locally. I'm not saying privatised, but do you think there's any way in which the good local initiatives that you can see in some places in terms of housing, in terms of community development, in terms of supporting education can be upscaled into the national agenda? Am I just too optimistic?
No, you're not too optimistic. We're not very good at collecting the good examples and celebrating them. One, for instance, is when academy chains were introduced, academy schools. The co-op movement created a co-op set of academies, which are based on ideas of working together and not competing. And so you can use the academy model to create schools that are good. When Margaret Thatcher, I think it was her, when she took away British Telecom's monopoly and made it possible for mobile phone companies to move in, and they'd always have it cheaper tariff than BT. The phone co-op was created, local initiative, that rather than take the extra money from the tariff as profit, simply gave you the cheapest possible mobile phone, and again by a co-op. Of course, I don't know, same for you, but for me, where we've been shopping for the last 8 months has been the local co-op, because it was easier to shop there rather than to drive around to a supermarket and queue for 40 minutes. And we kind of forgot that these initiatives were there. But we need a lot more. We have a very, very centralised state, which still has an empire ethos of we in London will tell you what to do, because we in London used to tell the whole world what to do. And now we've only got you to govern. And it's said endlessly, but you simply need to free local areas and regions up to have the power to do it themselves. If you look at energy production in Germany, you can see how it works.
Okay, next question. We've had a few people asking about UBI, so I'm going to choose one to sort of represent them. So David Finnegan was asking,
Yeah, just to ask a question, at what level do you think would be better to set universal basic income? Thank you.
It's very, very nice question. My answer is slightly ironic. I would use the market to set it. But you introduce it first on a low level, either for everybody, which could be, say, £1,000 a year or less, or you could introduce it for a new generation, which is cheaper. So when a particular set of people hit 18, they get it, next 18s, next 18s, and you can do it higher. And I'd set it at a low level, but increase it until it has the effect that you actually want and expect it to have. So you just simply increase it over time. And you define what that effect is. And until it has that effect, until you get to a point where people are actually free to choose what work they want to do, and if they don't want to work, they don't have to, you aim to still increase it. But I don't think you have to model it right now. I don't think you have to work out the magic number. The last person who did model it, by the way, was Gordon Brown. Gordon Brown paid Polly Sutherland, I think she was called, at the University of Southampton at the time, to produce a microsimulation model of basic income across the whole of Europe. So he was interested. And why across the whole of Europe? Well, if you're going to have monetary union, if you're going to have a euro, you're eventually going to have to harmonise tax and benefit systems across the EU 27. You can't possibly have all these stupid different tax and benefit systems if you've got free movement of labour. So what can you replace all those benefit systems with? And the answer is universal basic income for Europe. How do you begin to set it? You set it at only 1,000 or 2,000 euros a year. It's a lot of money on the edge of Europe. It's not much money in the middle. Apart from anything else, it's an incentive to actually stay on the edge of Europe and not move to the middle unless you want to. But Gordon Brown was looking at it years and years ago, before he was Prime Minister.
Interesting. Next question is Michael Howcroft.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the geographical scales that we talk about, particularly Brexit and populism, and whether there are things to be learned from not just talking about the national scale, whether we could sort of look at either bigger or smaller scales.
Yes, it's interesting. In that book Sally Thomason and I did, Rule Britannia, we have the Heineken map of Europe, which I didn't know existed before I began writing the book. Freddie Heineken was the man who owned a beer company. And I think in the early 90s, he paid 2 historians to produce a prediction of the future of Europe. And it wasn't taken very seriously until the war in Yugoslavia. And it actually turned out that they had predicted the way in which Yugoslavia would break up. And in general, what they said was that the largest countries were least stable. But countries like Germany, which have a federation, are more stable. The most interesting one was the predicted breakup of the UK. And remember, this was early 90s. And of course, Scotland went. Ireland is reunited. But the rest of England was divided, not into the regions that we are used to, but into slightly larger regions. And this may sound ridiculous, but I think there will come a point when the North has the kind of devolution that Wales currently has. And there will come a point where the Southwest is in a similar situation, and London is allowed to do things separately in the same way that Berlin can at the moment. And that's a level that we need to get to, and we need to get away. We mustn't forget, it's only 100 years since we were the centre of this largest empire. And this mentality is still there. We're like Rome, just after the Romans were the biggest empire in the world. And it takes some getting out of your head that not everything has to be run from the centre by students who went to Oxford or Cambridge University.
And we also have to remember that Heineken reaches the parts that other beers can't reach now.
All right, next question coming from Jeff.
Okay, thank you. Given your example of Finland in your book Fintopia and the level of cooperation, what do you think is going to happen with the Labour Party if they get in at the next election? Is this likely to be...
Yes, I think so. So the third largest party in Britain is the Scottish National Party. The last time that the third largest party was the Nationalist Party, I think, was the 1918 election, where Sinn Féin was the third largest party. Labour will almost certainly have to work with the SNP. It is increasingly difficult for Labour to say they can't, given how popular Nicola has been in Scotland, despite the fact that the pandemic's been just as bad in Scotland as England, just say it quietly. But Nicola clearly personally cares about everybody in Scotland. She's not lying, she obviously does. So that is the most important alliance, SNP and Labour, that will have to happen. There's no need for the antagonism with Liberals. Certainly, Greens should be on board. It's infuriated me my whole life, and it's been the story of the politics of not just my life, but my mother, who was involved in the Labour Party, and my grandfather. Always this split, since the 1920s, 30s, always this split on the progressive side of politics, meaning that the Conservatives are in for the majority of time, meaning that the country has dropped and dropped and dropped down the rankings. It's a huge irony that the political party, the Conservatives, most interested in Britain being number one, in taking back control, in Make England Great Again, are the party most responsible for moving us down the league table in Europe so far towards the bottom of that table in many, many ways. So alliances are absolutely necessary. And I think we can be grown up enough now that the parties, they should stop pretending they're not going to have them beforehand as well. You know, that kind of language isn't really needed anymore. There's no need for them to say. And certainly treating people as traitors if they advocate progressive politics and different parties, that's just childish and has to end, in my honest opinion. I can be as tribal as the best of them. I was brought up in a Labour family to distrust Liberals even more than Conservatives, right? So if you're tribalist, I do understand that. But after a century of this, it's just been too long for it.
All right, let's go. Phil White had a question about Wales.
Yeah, sorry, Phil's involved in a number of activist groups, particularly in 99% organisation. My question was, do you see initiatives like the Future Generations Act in Wales as being significant in creating a fairer society in the future?
It's really interesting watching Welsh politics at the moment. I'm very quietly impressed. So yes, certainly that act, but other initiatives, slightly like Finland, being done without great resources. Wales is kind of quietly kicking above its weight, and also without grandstanding, without these kind of national press conferences and so on. But looking at Future Generations, it's a very different attitude to what's going on in Northern Ireland or in Scotland. Wales is so umbilically connected to England at different points. The north of Wales is connected to Manchester and Liverpool. The middle is connected to Birmingham, and the south is connected to Bristol. Independence is a much more tricky option in Wales. So actually working out how you can be progressive while still being part of a larger state is being led by the Welsh. And I'd love to see it adopted in the north of England and in the southwest. There's no reason why we can't have this. And also, if you're wondering, why do we have a national lockdown in England? It's because England is a single country. It's because it's confusing otherwise to have it in different regions of England. You do actually have to devolve to federal states that are smaller than the size of England if you want to have that kind of autonomy. People become confused otherwise. So we should look at the success of politics in Wales and its innovation. And we really should plan to have similar sized population groups having a similar kind of power and not relying on London so much, on the Westminster Parliament so much to be so able. And one way of having a more progressive future is greater power to regional and national assemblies, which cannot be dominated by a small group of the elite in the same way that Westminster has been.
Sadly, we've got to start kind of drawing this to a close. I could listen to Danny Dorling all night, answer questions clearly, concisely, and pass every one. I mean, you're just you're more compass than any person I think we've ever had on the podcast, Danny, in terms of every answer. Leave us where we always ask people to leave us, about kind of what gives you hope. What got you on all of those trains, going to all of those meetings, and will hopefully get you back on the trains again? What spurs you on? What makes you write these books? What drives you, Danny?
There is a lot of optimism there. One thing I did discover actually about getting back on the trains was that places that voted leave were most likely to be places where the train might fail to get you back home from. So, it's a strange geography of the main areas are areas of really good train connections. But anyway, I did over 100 talks in Brexit leaving areas of Britain. Hope, basic human kindness and goodness. It is simply there. It can be kicked out of people. You can be kind of told that you're superior. You can have a history of this, and we've done it more than anywhere else, as I say, in Europe. When I was growing up, we had the most violent playgrounds, it turns out, in the continent. But it's a temporary thing. it's a temporary aberration. And if you look at what's happening over time, you can see that the levels of tolerance of younger people is higher, their ability is higher, their levels of education and understanding are higher, and they understand better that there are problems with being greedy and simply looking after yourself. But it really is much easier to feel this way if you can get out and see people and talk to them and listen to them, rather than being isolated in this kind of the machine stopped world where we are all sitting in our little individual bubbles. It's great we're talking, but this is slightly like there is no such thing as society, only people in their families. Lockdown has mean that I'm afraid you can't go out to society, you're not allowed there. All you've got is just yourself and your family. And as nice as your family might be, and might have been really well behaved, they haven't come through tonight. You do need more than just yourself and your family. It's what makes you happy. What is good is a good society. And that's what progressives want in politics. And people who are not progressive are quite happy with just themselves and their family and do think there is no such thing as society.
Well, thanks, Danny. And the good news is you can get home tonight, okay? You haven't missed the last train. You can sleep in your bed. That was brilliant. Whenever I talk to you, and it's not enough, I always feel better informed and happier and more optimistic about the world. And I hope everyone on the call does. So thank you so much for that. The next issue of It's Bloody Complicated is on Tuesday the 24th at 6 o'clock. Remember that we get complicated on every second and fourth Tuesday of every month. In the next session, Francis will be talking to Natasha Walter, the feminist author and director of Women for Refugee Women. Until then, thanks again, Danny. People have been sort of in the chat box saying how much they've enjoyed that, and I did. It's been great. I'm looking forward to listening to the recording again. Danny, keep safe. Everyone keep safe and keep hopeful. Good night all. Take care.
So, if you like what you've heard today and want to be part of a much more equal, democratic and sustainable future, a good society, then visit us at compassonline.org.uk/podcast, and you'll be able to join us live on future calls just like this one. You can tweet me at Neil, NEAL_Compass, or Compass at Compass Office. And if you've enjoyed this week's episode, please give us a rating. It will help us reach more listeners in the future. And it's only fair that they know it's bloody complicated too.